The purpose of this presentation is to assess the negative impacts of lead exposure on individuals' blood lead levels. And the main objectives that I will be covering today are the source of contamination, the human and environmental impacts that resulted from this lead contamination, as well as the actions that were taken by local authorities and officials in order to address and solve the crisis. So Zamfara is located in the northeastern part of Nigeria, and this presentation focuses on the 8 clustered villages that comprised the areas of the outbreak and served as a source of data collection by investigators, as well as some of the charts and graphs that you will see presented today. In 2010, the lead poisoning outbreak in rural villages of Zamfara state were some of the worst metal poisoning incidents in Nigeria, which resulted in over 17,000 people being poisoned and over 500 children dying within 7 months, starting in 2010. And during the period of the lead poisoning outbreak, a joint research was conducted by the Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, the CDC, and the WHO, as well as Nigerian health officials. It was revealed that within the 8 villages that were examined, 96% of the residences had life-threatening lead concentrations within their blood. So what were some of the sources of contamination that they found? They found that contaminated water, soil, as well as ingesting dust particles were the sources of exposures and the root of contamination. So lead poisoning can have a significant effect on humans and animals alike. It can cause permanent brain damage, kidney disease, seizures, coma, and even death. And some of these were observed within the region. So water samples were collected from 8 villages, as previously mentioned, and in each community, 10 groundwater samples were collected randomly, both from boreholes and wells. What they found was that the water was a great medium for actually transmitting these diseases and illnesses that were associated with lead poisoning. The researchers also found that soil was highly polluted with lead. So, for example, the U.S. standard is 400 parts per million, and sometimes some of the soils that they collected had readings as high as 60,000 parts per million. And since young children were playing on the ground, they would readily ingest the soil particles and the dust particles, just as, part of the normal, hand to mouth behavior that occurs, when children are playing. And these high concentrations that children were being exposed to was extremely harmful and detrimental to their health and their development. So there are many ways to extract minerals. 2 prominent ways would include dry mechanical processing and wet mechanical processing. And in wet mechanical processing, sort of like grinders are used to mill rocks in order to extract the gold particles. And in wet mechanical processing, water is of course used. And from this, the investigators actually concluded that the runoff water from this activity became the source of contamination that polluted the drinking wells. And as you can see in this chart, the dark green or the bold green, which represents the wet mechanical processing, was one of the major sources of contamination, specifically from mining. And the lead levels in water samples were analyzed by the investigators, and they found high levels, but particularly in 4 villages, including Topeki, Bagega, Tungar, Kudeku, and Doreda. The values that were obtained for all the water samples were higher than the WHO's maximum permissible limit, which is 0.01 parts per million. And Then concluded once again that groundwater and surface water may not be fit for drinking purposes. And in addition, the surface water, specifically from Bagega, did not meet the WHO and Nigerian standards of 10 micrograms per liter for lead limits, and actually exceeded this by more than tenfold, as you can see in this graph. So until the complete remediation of polluted villages took place, there was no available data that recorded the treatment efforts, especially in children in living in sensitive areas such as homes and compounds where artisanal gold mining actually took place. So lead inhalation continued to be such a high health risk for them. And this table shows the number of remediation cases in children starting in 2010 all the way to 2013, when the crisis had been controlled. So children aged less than 6 years old were especially vulnerable to the lead poisoning, which accounted for 0.6% of the global burden of disease in these rural villages. Air was also one way that I mentioned before, that children were able to inhale the dust particles while they were playing in the ground. And for villages that were remediated, lead intoxicated children were treated, and then later on they were able to return to their villages for recovery and follow-up care, which is why you see in this graph there's such a stark decrease in the blood lead levels among children starting in June 2010, where the phase 1 of the treatments began, and cleaning up phase began as well, all the way to the end of 2013. So this slide shows the pre and post remediation of soil lead concentrations for 8 different villages that were the focus of the investigations by the CDC, the WHO, as well as local Nigerian health officials. As you can see, the before and after reveal the success of the remediation efforts in those 8 villages. And these are just some of the solutions that the officials recommended in order to maintain the crisis under control long after remediation efforts were over. So, for example, they recommended installing alternative drinking supplies, continuing the remediation of wells as well as villages, building walls around the wells to prevent runoff, and preventing children from playing in informally contaminated sites, and continued hygienic practices such as washing hands before eating. And lastly, one recommendation that they made was the grinders that were used for processing ore should not have been used to process food in order to stop the contamination. So just to recap, in this presentation we discussed the 2010 lead poisoning in Zamfara, and we went through the link between the lead levels in water and its effects on the population in terms of contamination. We talked about water as being the major source of contamination and exposures for the population living in Zamfara. And we also talked about the need to carry out remediation of all water sources within this area in order to, number one, stop the spread and prevent this from happening again. Thank you.